What's going on? Boys, remember to arm yourself? Today we are talking about a few things. Phantom types. Something that came to me while I was playing Invisible. I think phantom types are a useful means of learning more about types. Less in how they work and more in what they mean. But to start, let's define some terms for this video and moving forward. The names we use for functions, their positions. For your traditional stack, we use and will be using dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior. I know a lot of people like using the hero-parent system, but I've always viewed that as a bit lame in and out of context. And despite your using your stack daily, I've always viewed your conscious functions as sterile clinical instruments, operated by you. You are the personalization, the product of your conscious functions agency. If you want them characterized or anthropomorphized, look in the mirror. Now, as far as I know, there aren't clinical words for your shadow functions, but even if they did exist, we wouldn't be using them. We're sticking with the nemesis, critic, blind spot, demon names for your shadow functions, because you don't control them, they control you. And even if you are on good terms with them, it's more of a discussion. You don't have a whole lot of say in how they operate. Those spots, those functions, should be characterized, because although they are in you and are you technically, they don't operate that way. You can use your dominant function. You can't use your nemesis function. You're either used by it or in a conversation with it. And we establish this operational mode for two reasons. One, people keep calling your inferior function your demon function, and that's incorrect on two levels, from 2 points of view, and I don't want people getting any more confused than they already are and are already going to be. There's a lot of value in typology, but it seems like the worst ways of extracting that value, or ways that turn that potential value into problems, are the ones that are most prominent. The second reason is it reinforces a way of looking at things, the way I find most value in the way I preach. Your conscious functions are your limbs, your instruments. Your shadow functions are your antagonists or benefactors hiding in the dark around you. And to divine value from phantom types, you need to have this perspective on conscious functions versus shadow functions, instruments versus voices. So what is a phantom type? Well, your shadow type is the type that uses your shadow functions in that exact order. What I'm calling your opposite, which is distinct from your shadow because your shadow isn't exactly your opposite, is the type that uses your shadow functions in the reverse order. Now, what I'm calling your phantom type is the type that inverts your inferior and nemesis functions while sharing two of your other functions. So my phantom type as an INTP would be an INFP, and I'm playing with the idea of the other inversion also being a phantom type, but I'm not sure yet. I'll need to do some more thinking about that. So right now for me, an ISFP might be, but an INFP would be most certainly. In any case, that similarity creates a better contrast because of the similarity. And cognitive function, MBTI, typology, whatever you want to call it, is interesting because it's a series of helixes. If there's something over here, there's almost certainly something over there, even if you haven't figured out what it is or how it operates yet. Phantom types are an example of this. I have been aware of this for a while in function, that certain types mirror their inferior and nemesis functions, and I'd used it before, but I hadn't really looked hard at it. And while I have no other huge conclusions than this is something to pay attention to, I do have some smaller observations I'm finding value in. And it's the sort of value that tells you something about the type and about the functions. Because you can look at your nemesis function as the darn it, you were that close function. If you had access to your nemesis function, full access, you would be a frightening human being. Your nemesis function is almost always that one thing you are just missing. TE is an ISTP and an INTP's nemesis function. If we could straight up apply our thoughts in a constructive way, a logistically reasonable way, the world would be very different. Instead, for most INTP and ISTPs, that sort of logisticsness requires great effort and practice, or systems we build using our conscious functions most often doesn't happen at all, when there are people walking around right now who can just do that. More it comes naturally to them. INFPs and ISFPs, Nemesis FE, they have a great idea of how the world should work, and they have it in them to take some measures sometimes to try to get closer to that world, but they can't feel the way they're making other people feel, even if they claim to care about those people, and they often end up becoming petty tyrants in the process. The kind that thinks they are doing the right thing, and so justifies their actions in that way. That close. If you had it in you to notice what other people are feeling or to care about it, you could have started that revolution. Phantom types are important because you get to see those two functions at their worst inverted. What it means to be in a bad relationship with this function, and what it means to want desperately a relationship with this function but not having it. Let's think about some examples. ISTJs and INTJs. They share borders in SE and NE. An ISTJ doesn't have SE, and they'll act like they don't want it most of the time. They'll spend large portions of their lives going, I have my things, I have my memories, I have my routines, I like my things, I don't want my things changed, I don't want other things. And then they'll have moments of utter gasping panic, realizing they either can't have other things, or they didn't get other things when they could have and now they can't. And in most instances, they could, mind you, still, depending on what it is. But they are almost always going to process this SE nemesis as a shortcoming, as a failure they can't overcome, and then they're going to torture themselves with it. Because ISTJs and INTJs share tertiary FI, remember. If you deal with them only on a verbal level, don't see them in action, or get into the nitty-gritty of things, they're going to seem similar, when they're very different. But then you have INTJs inferior SE. INTJs will be chugging along like normal, everything's great, they realize it's snowing, and then they are taken with the idea of getting really drunk right now and driving 120 miles an hour through the snow in the middle of the night, with their headphones in, just to see what happens. And they do it. And they do it because they actually feel that same fear of missing out sort of thing that ISTJs do, except an ISTJ can have the intrusive thought of impaling themselves. But for the INTJ, that spear is right in front of them. What does this tell us about SE, particularly at the lower levels, or in an FI-influenced way? SE carries an intense fear of loss. SE Nemesis, despite SI dominance, the picture of not moving, of anti-movement, Nemesis SE dominant SI mourns the moments not taken, tortures themselves with them. SE Inferior, feeling that same sort of SE fear of loss, will take bad moments or movements at inopportune times just to have some kind of movement. And they're probably doing weird intrusive thoughts shit because their SE is inferior and they don't know how to manage it well. But by contrasting V'ing the two different phantoms, we see, or we reveal in parallax, that fear of loss. And that may be obvious to some people, but to me, laying out the ability or the process of lining them up so you can see it, I find useful, interesting, and comforting. It's a way you can know and explain and share with people. And I know INFJs share that intrusive thoughts issue with INTJs, but they do handle it a bit differently, and I would bet good money if you lined up some INFJs and ISFJs and observed them over a long enough period, you would find something similar, and be able to see and enjoy the differences. Another set of phantoms I pay attention to, or I'm beginning to pay attention to, ENTJs and ENFJs. They invert TI and FI. ENTJs with FI, their FI is their self-knowledge and their moral codes. Not unbreakable moral codes, but moral codes they think should be unbreakable, even if they do break them frequently, and repress or excuse their knowledge of such so as not to immolate themselves. Until they do, because being confronted with that is enough to make a man hideous, inside and out. But then you take ENFJ Nemesis FI. ENFJs bother me as a type because they are like the worst case scenario of FI. An FI type getting a hold of the high level FE nuclear codes. Because the way I look at them, ENFJs are basically an FI type. Pretty much everything wrong with FI types you're going to see in ENFJs. They take on all of their bad. Unlike FI types, however, ENFJs don't have the decency of coming with FI's drawbacks. They have FE and TI to cover all of the flaws in this FI thinking system, or feeling system. Well, no, it is a thinking system. I haven't studied ENFJs enough to know how they would say it, but something apparent in their behavior is this need to uphold moral standards. Sort of in the way a higher FI type would, but in situations a lower FI type, or especially an FE type, probably wouldn't. An ENFJ is going to, not always, but when convenient, when they think they can get away with it, which is what distinguishes them from FI types, higher-end FI types who will stick their necks out no matter what. When an ENFJ thinks they can get away with it, even if it's risky, they'll stick their necks out to uphold a moral code. In spitting in the face of the way FE and lower FI typically operates. And this is even a little bit distinct from ESFJs, because SI, I'm noticing, tends to overwhelm or makes it necessary to express it differently that Nemesis FI. ESFJs see it and care, but they aren't going to shit on their SI openly to make that happen. And once again, in all FJ types, one of the ways you can see this shadow FI expressed using FE is not to stand up for a moral code, but to attack easy targets who appear not to abide by a popular moral code. That's the other thing that freaks me out about FE DOMs, because they don't inherently have that moral code. What they have is mastery of the expression of morality among people, not the source. And I think that's one of the reasons most FJs are a bit cunty, is they're aware they don't have it, but they do have that expression. It's like they perform FE in a performative manner to make up for their own knowledge of lacking FI. And ENFJs and ENTJs are useful as phantoms for that reason, understanding FI a bit better. In FI, we see a need for compliance, which is odd because that's something when you hear the word compliance, you think of that mostly with FE and TE, but using phantoms, we see it comes not from FE or TE, mostly from FI. The ENTJ has FI, but represses it. And they will repress it so they don't have to comply. But at some point, you must comply. And if you don't, you'll burn yourself alive. That is inferior, just having FI at an inferior level. And we wonder why FPs are so what they are. And I have typically associated what they are with tertiary and inferior TE. The insecurity that comes from lower or tertiary TE. But ENFJs, as an ENTJ's phantom, proves that compliance comes from FI. Because an ENFJ, their TE is their demon function. It's far away. It's going to destroy them one day, but it's not here right now. Yet ENFJs are one of the most compliance-centric types, in the sense of making other people comply, types out there. And it's because they are hyper-aware and hyper-concerned of and with a lack of compliance right behind them every single day. Again, I don't know how they would say it, but with ENTJs, there is a man on fire in their house. With an ENFJ, that man on fire is standing right outside their window. It's not in, but it's staring right at them. I have a feeling that's where many of their behaviors come from, or their tendencies. And this wouldn't become so apparent without phantom types. The controlling or complying aspect, TE plays a part in it, but it's coming ultimately from FI, which is weird. But now that we're aware of it, it's something we can think about, and now that we see the value of phantom types, it's a concept you can play with. I'll be playing with, and I'm interested to see what we come up with. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.